There's a silent epidemic sweeping through the lives of men over 35, and nobody wants to talk about it. Successful men, men with careers, families, responsibilities, men who by all external measures have their lives together, and yet on a Friday night, when the week is done and the house is quiet, they sit alone with a beer and realize something unsettling. They have no one to call, not because they're unlikable, not because they're broken, but because somewhere along the way, male friendship became extinct. This isn't about loneliness in the way society frames it, as some personal failing that therapy and self-help books can fix. This is about the systematic destruction of the spaces, structures, and cultural permission that allowed men to bond in the first place. Today we're pulling back the curtain on the male friendship crisis, what caused it, why society won't acknowledge it, and what it reveals about the forces shaping modern masculinity. This is Psycore. Let's get to the core of it. Section 1. The invisible crisis, but the data nobody wants to discuss. Let's start with the numbers because they're staggering. According to a 2021 survey by the Survey Center on American Life, 15% of men report having no close friendships at all. That's triple the rate from 1990. In the same study, only 21% of men said they'd received emotional support from a friend in the past week, compared to 41% of women. But here's where it gets interesting. When researchers dig deeper, they find that men over 40 are hit the hardest. A study published in Personal Relationships found that men's friendship networks shrink dramatically after age 35, with the average man losing 2/3 of his close friends between ages 25 and 55. The American Psychological Association calls it an epidemic of male loneliness. The media frames it as a mental health crisis. Politicians talk about building community resilience programs. But here's what they won't tell you. This isn't a bug in the system, it's a feature. The difference between loneliness and isolation. Before we go further, we need to make a critical distinction, one that society deliberately blurs. Loneliness is an emotional state. It's the feeling of disconnection, of wanting companionship you don't have. Isolation, on the other hand, can be a choice. It can be strategic. It can even be powerful. Many men over 40 aren't lonely. They're selectively isolated. They've looked at the shallow, performative friendships modern society offers and said, no thanks. They've weighed the cost of maintaining surface-level connections against the peace of solitude and chosen the latter. Society calls this a crisis because it threatens the social order. Men who don't need validation, who don't participate in the game, who are comfortable in their own company, these men are harder to control, harder to sell to, harder to shame into compliance. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. To understand how we got here, we need to go back, way back. Section 2. The destruction of male spaces. When male friendship was normal, for most of human history, male friendship wasn't something you had to work at. It was built into the fabric of society. In the 18th and 19th centuries, men gathered in lodges, Freemasons, Oddfellows, Knights of Pythias. These weren't just social clubs. They were structured spaces where men bonded through ritual, shared purpose, and mutual support. At their peak in the 1920s, nearly 1 in 4 American men belonged to a fraternal organization. Before that, it was guilds, workshops, taverns where tradesmen gathered after work, churches where men served together, volunteer fire brigades, sports leagues, hunting and fishing clubs. These weren't therapy sessions. Men didn't sit in circles talking about their feelings. They bonded shoulder to shoulder, working on shared projects, pursuing common goals, engaging in friendly competition. Anthropologist Lionel Tiger, in his groundbreaking book Men in Groups, called this male bonding, a biological and social imperative as fundamental to men as any other human need. He argued that men evolved to form coalitions for hunting, defense, and resource acquisition. The drive to connect with other men isn't cultural, it's hardwired. The systematic dismantling. So what happened? Starting in the 1960s and accelerating through the 80s and 90s, these male spaces began to disappear. Membership in fraternal organizations collapsed. By 2000, fewer than 5% of American men belonged to any kind of lodge or club. The reasons are complex, but 3 forces stand out. First, economic restructuring. The shift from manufacturing to service economy meant men no longer worked alongside other men in factories, construction sites, or workshops. The modern office, with its HR departments, sensitivity training, and constant surveillance, became a feminized space where traditional male bonding was viewed with suspicion. Second, suburbanization and commute culture. Men started spending 2 hours a day in cars, isolated, exhausted. The neighborhood bar, the local lodge, the community center all became casualties of sprawl and time poverty. Third, and this is the one nobody wants to talk about, cultural warfare against male-only spaces. Starting in the 1970s, Any institution that excluded women came under legal and social attack. Title IX forced integration of male sports leagues and clubs. Lawsuits targeted fraternal organizations. The cultural message was clear: male-only spaces were inherently discriminatory, probably dangerous, and definitely unnecessary. Now, I'm not arguing against equality, but here's the uncomfortable truth. Men and women bond differently. Women form friendships through face-to-face emotional intimacy. Men form friendships through shared activity and purpose. When you force male spaces to become co-ed, you don't create equality, you create spaces where neither men nor women can bond in their natural way. The rise of the toxic masculinity narrative. The final nail in the coffin came with the popularization of the term toxic masculinity in the 2010s. Suddenly, traditional male behaviors, competitiveness, stoicism, physical roughhousing, ball-busting humor, were pathologized. The very mechanisms through which men have bonded for millennia were reframed as dangerous, problematic, in need of correction. Men got the message: your natural way of connecting is wrong. You need to be more like women, more emotionally open, more vulnerable, more willing to sit in circles and share your feelings. And here's the thing, some men tried. They went to men's groups, they did the therapy speak, they learned to say, I feel, instead of I think. And it didn't work, because it wasn't authentic. It was a performance of what society said male friendship should look like, not what it actually is. Section 3. What society won't tell you. Male bonding is fundamentally different. Let's talk about the science society ignores. Research by evolutionary psychologists like Joyce Benenson at Harvard has consistently shown that male and female friendship patterns are neurologically and hormonally different. Women's friendships are characterized by high emotional intimacy, frequent communication, and face-to-face interaction. This is driven partly by oxytocin, the bonding hormone that spikes during emotional sharing and physical touch. Men's friendships, by contrast, are characterized by shared activity, loyalty, and instrumental support. They're driven more by testosterone and vasopressin, hormones associated with competition, hierarchy, and coalition building. This isn't cultural conditioning. Studies of boys as young as 3 show these patterns emerging before socialization could possibly explain them. Here's what this means in practice. Men don't bond by talking about their problems. They bond by solving problems together. A man doesn't feel close to another man because they had a deep conversation about their childhood trauma. He feels close because they built a deck together, because they played on the same basketball team, because they survived a difficult project at work side by side. The activity is the vehicle, the bond is the byproduct. Why modern solutions fail? This is why every modern attempt to solve the male friendship crisis falls flat. Men's therapy groups? They're designed around female bonding patterns. Sit in a circle, share your feelings, receive validation. For most men, this feels forced and uncomfortable. Bromance culture and male vulnerability movements, they're asking men to perform emotional intimacy in ways that don't come naturally, then shaming them when it feels inauthentic. Even well-intentioned advice. Just reach out to old friends. Be more vulnerable. Schedule regular hangouts misses the point. Men don't want to schedule emotional labor. They want to do things together. The hidden function of male friendship. Here's what society really doesn't want you to understand. Male friendship has always served a specific evolutionary and social function that goes beyond emotional support. Throughout history, male coalitions have been the primary check on tyranny. When men bond, they become harder to control. They develop loyalty to each other that supersedes loyalty to institutions. They create parallel power structures. This is why authoritarian regimes always target male social organizations first. It's why totalitarian movements work to atomize men, to make them dependent on the state rather than each other. The destruction of male friendship isn't an accident of modernity. It's a feature of a society that benefits from isolated, atomized individuals who look to corporations, government, and therapeutic institutions for the support they once got from each other. Lonely men are profitable. They consume more. They're easier to market to. They're more politically compliant. They don't organize, they don't resist. The male friendship crisis isn't a crisis for men. It's a crisis of men for everyone else. Section 4. Brotherhood versus friendship. Why best friends is a female concept. Let's address something that confuses a lot of men. The cultural expectation that you should have a best friend. This is fundamentally a female social model. Women typically have 1 or 2 extremely close friends with whom they share everything. These relationships are intense, emotionally intimate, and often exclusive. Men historically have operated differently. Instead of one best friend, men have had bands of brothers, groups of 4 or 8 men with whom they share loyalty, purpose, and camaraderie. Think about it. The Spartans didn't have best friends. They had phalanxes. Medieval knights didn't have best friends, they had orders. Even in modern military units, the strongest bonds aren't between two men, they're among the squad. This is shoulder-to-shoulder bonding. You're not facing each other, examining each other's emotions. You're standing side by side, facing outward toward a common challenge. The power of purpose-driven connection. Here's the secret that modern society has forgotten. Men don't need friends, they need brothers. And brotherhood is forged through shared mission. You don't become brothers by hanging out and talking. You become brothers by building something together, competing together, overcoming adversity together, pursuing a common goal together. This is why men who serve in the military, play on sports teams, or work in high-stakes professions often form the deepest bonds. It's not the time spent together, it's the shared purpose and mutual reliance. Selective bonding as strength. And here's the final piece society won't acknowledge. Not all men need or want extensive social networks. Some of the most powerful, fulfilled men in history were relatively solitary. They had a small circle of trusted brothers and were perfectly content with that. The cultural pressure to have a large friend group, to be constantly social, to never be alone, this is feminine social anxiety projected onto men. Many men over 40 who society labels as isolated aren't suffering, they're selectively bonded. They have 2 or 3 men they'd go to war for, and that's enough. They've rejected the shallow, performative friendships of their youth in favor of depth over breadth. This isn't a crisis, it's wisdom. Section 5. The path forward. How to build authentic male connection. So if you're a man who genuinely wants to build or rebuild brotherhood, here's what actually works based on how men have bonded for millennia, not how therapy culture says you should bond. First, find mission-based communities. Don't look for friend groups. Look for groups organized around doing something. Brazilian jiu-jitsu gyms, woodworking clubs, volunteer fire departments, shooting ranges, motorcycle clubs, men's rugby leagues, classic car restoration groups, hiking and mountaineering clubs. The activity doesn't matter. What matters is that it's physically or mentally challenging, requires skill development, has natural hierarchy and progression, involves regular commitment, attracts other men seeking the same thing. You don't join to make friends, you join to get better at the thing. The brotherhood emerges as a byproduct. Second, embrace hierarchy and competition. This will sound controversial, but it's essential. Healthy male bonding requires both hierarchy and competition. Men need to know where they stand. They need to test themselves against other men. They need to earn respect through competence, not just receive it for showing up. This is why sports work, why martial arts work, why military units work. There's a clear structure, measurable progress, and the opportunity to prove yourself. Modern society tries to eliminate hierarchy and competition from male spaces, calling them toxic. But without these elements, men don't bond, they just coexist. Third, stop apologizing for male-only spaces. If you want to create or join a male-only group, do it unapologetically. You don't need to justify it. You don't need to explain that it's not about excluding women. You don't need to add disclaimers about toxic masculinity. Men have the right to gather with other men just as women have the right to gather with other women. The fact that this has become controversial tells you everything you need to know about the cultural forces at play. Fourth, quality over quantity. Always stop trying to maintain friendships that feel like obligations. Stop forcing connections that aren't natural. Stop attending social events out of guilt. If you have 2 or 3 men you genuinely trust who you'd call at 3 a.m., who share your values and would stand with you when things get hard, you're not isolated, you're strategically bonded. Better to have 3 brothers than 30 acquaintances. What you don't need. Let's be clear about what you don't need to do. You don't need to work on your vulnerability. You don't need to schedule regular check-ins with male friends. You don't need to join a men's therapy group. You don't need to force emotional conversations over Psycore. You don't need to adopt feminine friendship patterns. These might work for some men, but if they feel inauthentic to you, trust that instinct. Your way of bonding isn't broken just because it doesn't look like what society says it should. The philosophical core. Here's the deeper truth. Male friendship at its best is about becoming better men together, not through emotional processing, not through vulnerability performances, but through holding each other to higher standards, challenging each other to grow, supporting each other's missions, maintaining loyalty through adversity, building something larger than yourselves. This is what the ancient Greeks called philia, brotherly love based on shared virtue and mutual respect. It's what medieval knights called fealty. It's what soldiers call esprit de corps. It's not therapy. It's not self-help. It's brotherhood forged through shared purpose and mutual excellence. Closing. The male friendship crisis is real, but it's not what society says it is. It's not about men being too emotionally stunted to connect. It's not about toxic masculinity preventing intimacy. It's not about men needing to learn how to be more like women. It's about the systematic destruction of the spaces, structures, and cultural permission that allowed men to bond in their natural way. It's about a society that benefits from isolated, atomized men who look to institutions rather than each other for support. And it's about men waking up to this reality and choosing a different path. You don't need to fix yourself. You don't need therapy to learn how to have friends. You need to reject the false narrative that your way of bonding is broken, find other men pursuing meaningful missions, and build brotherhood through shared purpose. The men who came before us understood this. The lodges, the guilds, the warrior bands. They all knew that male friendship isn't about feelings. It's about standing shoulder to shoulder, facing outward toward a common challenge. That truth hasn't changed. It's just been buried under decades of cultural conditioning. But you can unbury it, starting today. This is Psycore. Question everything, especially what society tells you about yourself.